Welcome to another episode of the Golden Hour. I'm Rashad Bader, and I'm here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, nice to see you again.
Hey, Rashad. Good to be back here with you.
Wonderful. So, Kevin, I wanted to bring you a question that we received from one of our super users who's rolling OptimalWork out at his organization. I thought it was a great question. Here, I'll actually just read it straight from the email. So, he had some earlier text. And then he goes on to say, a final question that I'm getting a lot right now is what is the difference between deep work and optimal work? And it's actually not the first time I've received that question. I've received it many times. And so that was sort of the impetus for saying, hey, why don't we record a podcast on this? So, Kevin, what do you think is the difference between deep work and optimal work?
Yeah, Rashad, I think it's a great question. And I read Deep Work with a lot of joy. So, and when it first came out, I got it right away. I had known Cal Newport since I think 2011, and I'd had a couple meals with him, and actually some hours of conversation. And he's a really wonderful guy. And at the time, he was finishing his studies at MIT, and I think that he has really a knack for discerning what are the practices that certain people are using that really help them to thrive. He doesn't in any way claim to be providing a kind of psychology of work. I think of optimal work as actually more of a psychology of work. So it's more of a broader theory, and it's so I think that we speak to challenges and how people are thriving on challenge, how they're engaging challenges and turning them into opportunities. That kind of psychology, which extends to talk about anxiety and then how to deal with distraction and then how to find meaning and ideals as you kind of go up these different axes in the brain, which we've talked about in other podcasts. I think it's actually a very complete psychology, and it has it ties together a lot of elements so that essentially your work, an hour of work, any kind of work, turns into a kind of gym for your soul. So you're able to work out and all these things, and you get out of threat mode, and you get better and better at doing that, and you get better at thriving on adrenaline. But you also learn how to bring silence to your mind and stillness, to intensity of focus, and you find ways of transcending your own self-satisfaction as a goal and getting outcomes done and working for higher motives, ideals, and bonds. So I see that the deep work component of Cal Newport really fits into the distraction part. And so it's really about how do you manage the relationship between task attention and your background default attention. And so what he provides in deep work is a very nice account of how some people are able to get very effective work done without interruptions. So that I think is the way I would say the difference. Essentially, he presents us with best practices that can work really well for some people, but not as
Got it.
super. And he doesn't tend to claim it's a super comprehensive theory. So maybe I'm a bigger into making that kind of claim.
No, that's great. That's helpful. For those who aren't familiar with deep work beyond what you just said, right? I actually didn't know that you had gotten together with Dr. Newport. That's really exciting. That's fun. For those who aren't familiar with deep work or Dr. Newport's work beyond that, uh, what would you say is the key insight from deep work?
Well, I would say that the key practice of deep work, which is not what you asked, is setting aside large blocks of time. So, and it could be a week, or it could be a semester, it could be half of a week, certain days a week repeatedly. It could be every morning, but it's really big blocks of time that you're setting aside to do a deeper dive into one important task. So that is the practice in a nutshell. I actually want to read from the book because he quotes an author I love, Serge Lange, who wrote a book in the 1920s called The Intellectual Life. If people have been taking the inventory and they've ever gotten it on OptimalWork.com, and they've ever gotten the advice on basically deepening their professional knowledge through reading. I can't remember exactly how I I'll rephrase it there. But the advice we give on that is like, for example, on Sundays, I'm going to read an hour of The Intellectual Life or something like that. But this is the book, and it's actually quoted very early on in Deep Work. And so I want to just here quote you, Cal Newport, quoting Sir Lange. Let your mind become a lens, thanks to the converging rays of attention. Let your soul be all intent on whatever it is that is established in your mind as a dominant, wholly absorbing idea. And then he quotes Sir Lange again. Men of genius themselves were great only by bringing all their power to bear on the point which they had decided to show their full measure. The idea is this the deep work approach is not really, I think, meant for everyone, but it is meant for people who are trying to leave a mark on a field. So if you're trying to make an impact in one particular field, then you're going to be working with ideas and you're going to be doing very difficult work pioneering and pushing forward. And so Certain Launch here is saying that you have to settle like what is the one focus you're going to really go deeply into and fully commit yourself to that. And this idea that the mind is a lens and that it needs to be really focusing the rays of your attention in a sustained way. So, really, then, how do you sustain that kind of focus for longer periods of time so that you get really high quality work done? Because he thinks that high quality production is simply the intensity of work times the time. And so, if you're working very intensely, deeply, having deeply dove into it, then that with a certain extension of time produces these great results.
And it seems that Dr. Newport also places a greater emphasis on productivity and outcomes than, say, we would. Right? We oftentimes talk about sort of placing the relative emphasis on the process or shaping how you work rather than focusing on the outcomes. Do you think that's a fair difference between deep work and optimal work?
Well, I think that it might just not be his intention to help people beyond productivity. And so it might be that you could think of family vacations as like a kind of deep work for relationships, and you're going to do a sustained dive. So there could be ways of doing it. I think that um, what I see as the perhaps the bigger danger of this particular best practice is that it could get people to have a provisional mentality, that they think that, well, I'm not right, I don't have the right conditions right now to do real deep work. So then they don't really try. Or they think that uh, that they need very large blocks of time to get anything real done. And so they don't start. Now, that's not a criticism of the theory of deep work or the practice, but it is just how people could misuse it. So I think we don't want people putting off getting even good, deep intellectual work done. And so, just at the level that he's dealing at in terms of, like how to be effective and productive, it could backfire if people are delaying actually getting work done until they have big swaths or somehow they feel like the conditions aren't right and then they set aside a huge amount of time and then still they feel the conditions aren't right and they get increasingly frustrated, that, oh, now my time is wasting. And so there have been Pulitzer Prize winning authors who were stay-at-home moms and were taking care of their kids and were doing their writing in between things. And they wrote at the level able to win a Pulitzer Prize. So it's like so I think that it's capable. People are capable of doing extraordinarily good work in even small blocks of time. And but here is also a matter of priorities. That is how do you get people to focus on an area, like within their possibility of development that really is worth investing in. Because if people really ask themselves when they see how much time they're spending on different processes and different things, they could see that, wow, there's not a lot of really high quality objects of my investing time. But they don't realize it because they never tried setting aside a large amount of time for anything. So sometimes you're going to think, okay, if I'm just going to work for 3 days on one particular uh, question, one particular project, what would it be? Well, that would have to make you, it'd force you to really think about what are my top priorities? And maybe there is something that would be really interesting to do that with, but you just never made time for it.
So it seems to me then that there isn't necessarily a direct addressing of how helpful even small things are in terms of us growing in who we are with work. It seems that Dr. Newport kind of creates this dichotomy almost between this deep work, highly intellectual work, work that requires mastery and making a huge impact, and then perhaps everything else. And that's not necessarily also what we say, right, Kevin?
Yeah, it's one of the unfortunate phrases in the book is the term shallow work. Yeah, and shallow work is, you'd have to say, most of what most people do. So it's, things that are more logistical or things that are more, well, in my mind, it's like that is as capable of being enriched with ideals and made meaningful as deep work. So that would be another perhaps thing, of, and you're right when when you talk about this idea of productivity, that it is an issue that if the whole goal is just getting people more productive, that can elevate outcomes to too high a pedestal. The whole purpose of any outcome has to be something else that transcends it. There has to be something that's a source of meaning. So just getting this many publications, well, that doesn't really have any meaning. And so the more people are focused on productivity, I think the more danger there is that it's really a kind of self-satisfaction they're seeking. And they're wanting to feel a certain satisfaction once this is milestone is achieved. So now those milestones could be very good milestones to achieve, but they could be done with the wrong motive. Doing it for like a personal sense of completion. And that's what satisfaction is. It's like a personal experience of completion. And we all get a little bit of that when we finish things. But that's different than what you get from really fulfilling work. When you're really acting on ideals, you know, growing in a virtue doesn't feel satisfying in the moment, but it is completing, in a much, much deeper way. So, no one who has like a virtue of patience to a very high degree is actually feeling satisfied when they're exercising patience, but they do feel joy actually, that they can stay joyful in the midst of trials. Well, I think any kind of work gives you the ability to grow in ideals. You can always find some way of turning that work into love and service. And so as you turn the work into love and service, I think you see that it becomes beautiful no matter what it is, and no matter how long it goes on for. And that transcends outcomes. It transcends what you're actually accomplishing in productivity, and puts them in the right context. That really the only real reason to be productive is to love and serve others, to grow yourself.
And that's a perfect sort of emphasis on what optimal work is, right? Say versus other systems such as deep work or others, even though those may have very good things in and of themselves. But as we're talking, I want to sort of circle back. So we've spoken a little bit about Dr. Newport's work. We've spoken a little bit now about some of the things that optimal work strives for. But I keep coming back to that question, which is, what is the difference between deep work and optimal work? So if someone's listening and they ask that question and they're not very familiar with us, they may say, okay, well that sounds great. That in fact there could be a higher calling to work, that we can try and make even the small things infused with love and service. Okay, how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? So again, so for regular listeners, they may be more familiar with this, but how would you answer that question, Kevin, to someone who's not familiar with optimal work?
I would say optimal work is actually focused on challenge and actively challenging yourself in any kind of task by bringing your highest ideals into that task. Now, so that you can see that task as a way of growing and learning and practicing something. So it might be that in a particular task, it's enough that you're growing in a skill. But that skill still needs to be serving some other higher kind of reason that you're using it. And ultimately, it has to be some kind of service. It's really your bonds with others that are being built by doing very high quality work. So there's some kind of so I think that we are very much into how you can approach work in a way that ends up being transcendent of self and transcendent of productivity. So now, if you have that framework, then I think you can put all the things in deep work to very good use because you will then actually you can actually serve in a more generous and complete way. So you can have greater creativity because you had built these temporary or temporal silos, in your life where you could do this kind of focused work. But just on its own, focusing on a practice of like by itself, apart from any context, would be very left-brained, and it would have to be just aimed at productivity. And optimal work is very right-brained and is aimed at actually elevating outcomes and putting them in the service of higher goods.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it reminds me of our ideals module in the masterclass, which talks about growing in sincerity, humility, and generosity, and how that's sort of the natural fruit of, if we look at reframing mindfulness and challenge, that is really, it's sort of the transcendent aspect of our theory of growth. And it takes us into the cultivation of those ideals.
That's exactly right. And just to say that this thing of am I working for the goal of self-satisfaction? I think that is a very important question that we ask ourselves. When we're seeking ourself and to satisfy ourself, it kind of it can metastasize. That intention metastasizes to everything we do. And so, uh, and it's a very interior process of change, and kind of elevation that starts to help you overcome that. And the thing that is like the means, by which you have like for overcoming that is one, it's really your willingness to make sacrifices. That if you get too fixed on some kind of outcome, you become unwilling to you basically shut out important elements of life just to get this thing done or accomplished because that's all you're focused on, like a politician getting elected and all he wants to do is get elected, but then he totally neglects everyone else in his life, like the saying, behind every great man is a miserable family. So that because they like they're just like essentially a parasite on their family, living off of them while they're pursuing the objectives. And so I think that's that's what it can happen. We end up really just serving our own sense of satisfaction versus transcending ourselves. You could call that the inward collapse of desire. Like all the person's desires are just collapsed within themselves, and all they experience is either satisfaction or frustration. But the satisfaction wears off quickly, and the frustration does not wear off quickly. So, in that paradigm, you are more and more stuck feeling frustrated in life. And so, because eventually you get to a point in your career where the next promotion becomes less likely, and then they can be left feeling frustrated. Well, that doesn't happen, I think, if you really are trying to work with some kind of higher motive, a more meaningful motive. But we call that reframing. It's like, okay, how is this task giving me an opportunity to serve others? How is it giving me an opportunity to grow? If you can find a purpose in this, then you make that your actual object of your will. And then you get, as you make progress towards it, you get more and more joy and you get less and less frustration. But you may not actually get that sense of satisfaction, and you have to be willing to go without that. And that is the sacrifice you have to be willing to make.
That's beautiful. And that's something that, as I'm thinking, I'm placing myself again in the shoes of someone who would ask the question, sort of what's the difference between deep work and optimal work? My guess is that they looked at the golden hour and saw a tool. And what you described here is sort of the theory of growth behind this tool. And so the tool itself is not necessarily about setting a timer or even necessarily getting into that state of deep work, though, again, there's certainly benefits in growing in excellence in your work. But it's ultimately aimed at all of the things that you mentioned. Would you tell us a little bit more about how all of those goals that you had just mentioned fit into a golden hour specifically? And how would a golden hour, say, be any different than something in deep work where someone has siloed off some time, whether it be a 1 hour, 3 hours, or whatever it may be?
I think that the idea of the golden hour is it's simply a way of shaping what you're about to do. And it can be lived in any kind of work or any kind of circumstance. You just need to think, how is it? Like, what would be the best way for me to somehow stretch myself in this upcoming hour? How do I lean into the stretch and challenge myself in this next thing? But you end up developing a new relationship to challenge where you're habitually challenging yourself in higher and higher ways. In the beginning, it's easiest to challenge yourself just to be developing certain skills. And that's a great way of starting to think about challenge. But those just start to coalesce into more meaningful kinds of virtues that you're living. So when you make that your goal, we call that an ideal. The ideal is what you're aiming for in this task. So you learn to aim for cheerfulness. That might not apply to all hours of work. Someone just asked us if if I'm, what does it mean to, like, for the next hour, if I'm writing a paper, to do that cheerfully? Well, that might not be the easiest one to bring into that particular thing. But even then, when you start feeling like you're complaining about the task, cheerfulness wards off complaints and it stabilizes your reframe. So just trying to be stable and reframing and quick to reframe, being quick to reframe is a skill, but cheerfulness actually is one of the ideals that guides it and kind of gives it life and meaning. But then it lends itself to really developing bonds all around you. And that's the real, so it leads you to transcend yourself and really form these meaningful bonds with others. So I think that the golden hour it works very well for getting 45 to 90 minutes of work done. Maybe less, maybe more, but that's usually what we tell people. So because you're just putting order into what you're about to do, and it just, in that sense, it has to work. Yeah, and if you don't have steps to follow in the golden hour, you're just looking for some trigger for practice. So, okay, you might just be looking for your doctor in an ER. Okay, how could I be practicing cheerfulness in this next hour of work? That would be a kind of work that would lend itself very well to cheerfulness. And then when people are short with you and people are, demanding or sassy or whatever, you just respond cheerfully, and you could rack up that practice pretty quickly. So I think that we have a very flexible approach built on reframing, mindfulness, and challenge, actively challenging yourself. And that allows, I think, for a theory of growth and how we end up having fulfilling lives. Um, the uh, I think if a person has the ability to bring in the deep work methods into their life, they could end up serving society in an even greater way. Because it, again, is for people who want to make a lasting impact, I think, in their field. That seems to be the best case use of it. And so in that case, it's even better, but in the right context, which we could perhaps say that Newport assumes this kind of context of
That's
the
right.
broader. Yeah.
I think so. Are there any particular rituals from deep work that you particularly like? Perhaps something that aligns with optimal work, or things that you saw that are like, hey, those are also really good rituals. Anything jump out to you?
No, I think the main idea that I find is, he talks about different ways you can incorporate this, and it could be that you're taking a week off or much longer, and that's kind of the idea of a sabbatical, is that, professors would take a long amount of time off just to do this kind of work. Um, I've never had the luxury of being able to do that, so, but, I have at times had a few days I could take off for a deeper dive into something. Um, in fact, one of the very first times I did that, it was before developing one of my websites, that, in writing all of that, I, uh, I did take, like, 3 days or 4 days off, went to a place in the mountain and in Vermont, and I just worked. The and I had actually read Deep Work the weekend before. So so it was very good timing. I'd already planned the trip, but it was just good confirmation that, okay, this is a good thing. It's just so I think if you for me personally, I do like being able I have certain days each week that I don't have patients scheduled, and that does allow me also to have a deeper dive. So, and I group my patients together. So I think I'm probably living a lot of those principles. But that's I think that's the main thing that I get from that.
Wonderful. Okay, to all our listeners, if you're familiar with deep work and you have any other follow-on questions from this podcast, please send us a message. And if you have other similar questions, we'd love to receive them. And as you can see, we try to get to them when we can. We'll probably email you back directly, and then we may even record a podcast. So with that, thank you, Kevin, and thank you all.
Thank you.